At the same time, she gave the man enough hope to stay blinded. She showed him precisely enough sympathy to make him trust her judgment. She recommended a string of consultants, people who would create reports, draft strategies, and, unknowingly, tighten the loop of accountability she needed. She counseled him to move assets, to defer payments, to reassure partners. Each recommendation was a strand in the web she was weaving. He clung to her advice like a life preserver, unaware that the rope was frayed in the places she'd secretly cut. There were nights when she wondered who she'd become in the process. She had once wanted only to be seen. Now she had become someone who could make a life unravel. The mirror showed a woman who rarely laughed at frivolity, who kept her expressions measured, who let victories arrive quietly and without fanfare. She loved her mother more than ever, and the small kindnesses she could offer, taking her out to dinner, slipping checks into envelopes when visits coincided with bills, felt like righteous repair. But she also recognized the small, sharp satisfaction in watching arrogance dissolve when held to account. If the world refused to give her the fair story she deserved, she would write a different ending. When the first subpoenas arrived, they were not candles on a cake or celebratory announcements. They were quiet, cold envelopes that signaled the start of a legal machinery that could not be turned back. His public relations team scrambled. His partners sought to distance themselves. The press smelled blood, and in the weeks that followed, stories leaked that suggested mismanagement and worse. He called her in a trembling voice, more child than man. "Who did this?" he demanded. "Who turned on me?" He had no sense of irony that the very people he had privileged now walked away when the consequences came. "I don't know," she said. "But you know how this looks." She let him stew in it. She let the slow, suffocating pressure of investigations do the rest. Her role became administrative and precise, information provided at the right time, contacts nudged with deliberate hints, documents handed to the right auditors. It was a clinical process, like surgery without anesthesia, necessary and precise. She imagined, sometimes, that this was repair rather than revenge, that a man built on crooked foundations needed to be taken down so the world could be safer for others. That rationalization washed over the sting of personal grievance and baptized it with something like morality. Still, the personal moments were the ones she kept for herself. She imagined him sitting alone in a small, unheated room, remembering a table where a young girl had once placed her carefully earned A's only to be ignored. She imagined his children, once proud and cushioned, now squinting at the starkness of bank statements, suddenly aware that luxury required more skill and honesty than they possessed. She imagined the quiet of his days as the cameras and the parties and the applause evaporated, leaving him with an inventory of what he had done. She did not rush the end. Collapses are most satisfying when slow enough to let the guilty understand the shape of their falling. When the lawsuits became public and the auctions were announced for previously opulent properties, she watched headlines scroll by over morning coffee in a kitchen lit by the gentle, honest light of a new home she had bought for her mother. People texted her condolences, strange, perfunctory messages from old neighbors who had once envied their life. She read them like postcards from a country she had left years ago. One afternoon, months into the unraveling, she met him for the first time since he had pleaded for help. He was thinner, a softness where arrogance had lived. He held a paper cup of coffee like a talisman, as if the last trappings of comfort had become objects to clutch. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the contempt that had kept him above her, but a raw, naked fear. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice small. She had answers ready, catalogs of slights, each an arrow in a quiver. But she also carried a steadier answer, one that had nothing to do with retribution and everything to do with the rules she had decided to live by. "You do not build a life by erasing others," she said instead, quietly, "because fairness matters." He laughed then, a short, incredulous sound. "Fairness? Since when did you become a moral compass?" She watched his confusion and felt no triumph, only a calm that came from the completion of a task no one had given her the right tools for earlier in life. "I became what I needed to be," she answered. "And now we live with the consequences." Then she turned and walked away, Not because she was cruel, but because she had finally finished the long, patient work of making herself impossible to ignore. She remembered the way he used to hold court at the dinner table, his voice filling every inch of silence, his laughter drowning out everyone else's stories. His children were allowed to chatter, to boast, to exaggerate until the truth was unrecognizable, and he would nod and grin, pouring more wine, giving them all the space they wanted. But when she tried to speak, when Anna began to share something she was proud of, his eyes would glaze over, his fork would clink too loudly against his plate, or he would interrupt with a story about someone else. It was as though her words evaporated before they left her lips. She began to ration her sentences, speaking less and less until her presence at that table was almost ghost-like. Silence became her armor, and observation her weapon. She learned early on how much people revealed when they believed someone wasn't paying attention. She noticed how his fingers drummed on the table when he was nervous, how he would squeeze the base of his wine glass when a business call hadn't gone his way. She saw how his smile tightened when his son disappointed him, though he still showered him with gifts, masking the disappointment with dollar bills. She saw how his daughter's complaints about boredom or unfair teachers were met with immediate promises to fix things. And she saw her mother shrink a little smaller each day, too tired to argue, too grateful for financial security to raise her voice against the inequities in the household. Anna told herself that nothing was wasted. Not her silence, not the hurt, not the endless stream of nights where she cried into her pillow. Every memory became material. Every slight was stored away with meticulous care. Where others carried diaries filled with love notes and daydreams, Anna's private record was one of omissions. The toy never bought, the hug never given, the applause that never came. And while some people buried their pain, she treated hers like seed. She buried it deliberately, knowing it would grow into something stronger if left undisturbed. In college, she rarely spoke of her family. Friends asked about her parents, about holidays back home, and she answered in vague phrases that ended conversations quickly. She was careful never to let bitterness slip through. She had seen how people judged those who couldn't let go of the past. Instead, she focused her energy on showing that she was indispensable. When others studied just enough, she stayed up until dawn. When classmates sought easy internships, she fought for the grueling ones. When others wanted recognition, she built results too solid to ignore. The day she was offered her first promotion, she walked into the women's bathroom afterward, locked herself in a stall, and allowed tears to fall silently, not from sadness, but from the raw relief of having proof that effort counted. She wiped her face, reapplied her lipstick, and walked back into the office like nothing had happened. No one needed to see how much it meant. The victory was hers alone, and she wasn't going to give anyone else the satisfaction of knowing how hard won it had been. Her stepfather's decline unfolded with the same inevitability as a storm that had been forecast for years. She didn't need to wish it into existence. The rot had been there all along. The missed payments, the over-leveraged loans, the arrogance that kept him blind to small cracks until they widened into chasms, these were the natural consequences of a man who believed rules were for other people. What she did was give gravity a nudge. She made sure the right eyes saw the wrong numbers, that the questions no one had asked before were finally raised. There was something almost poetic about watching the headlines. She sat in her apartment, scrolling through articles about his lawsuits, and thought about the countless times she had sat in the background while he bragged about his unshakable empire. She imagined him reading the same articles, his hand gripping his phone so tightly the screen might crack. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate out loud. The satisfaction wasn't in his pain, it was in the balance being restored, in knowing that the man who once told her she was not his responsibility had finally learned what it meant to stand alone. His children were the most unprepared. They had grown fat on luxury, and when the feast ended, they had nothing left but hunger. His son, once arrogant and smug, found himself working jobs that barely covered rent. His daughter, who had once paraded handbags and vacations, now sat in small apartments scrolling endlessly through old photographs of better days, unable to recreate the life she had been handed. Anna watched them falter from a distance, not out of cruelty, but because they were not her concern. She had spent too many years as an afterthought to make anyone else the center of her world. When she met him in that shabby coffee shop months after his empire collapsed, she was almost startled by how diminished he looked. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his shoes scuffed in a way she had never seen before. He spoke in a rasp that carried none of the booming authority he had once wielded at dinner tables. The man who had once filled rooms now barely seemed to occupy his own chair. "You could have saved me," he said again, his eyes bloodshot, his hand trembling against the paper cup. "You had the knowledge. You had the power. Why didn't you?" Anna studied him for a long moment. The truth was that she could have saved him. She could have stitched his business together long enough to give him breathing room, could have taught him the discipline he never had, could have spared his children the shock of sudden poverty. But to do so would have been a betrayal of everything she had endured, of every night she had convinced herself that pain had a purpose. "I learned from you," she said quietly. "You taught me that some people don't deserve second chances. You made sure I understood that worth was measured in action, not words. I'm only giving you what you gave me." He stared at her, his mouth opening as if to argue, but no words came. For the first time in her life, Anna saw him speechless. It was almost anticlimactic, the way the mighty always fell, not with a dramatic roar but with a quiet, pathetic whimper. She stood, smoothed her coat, and left him there, knowing he would never recover. Walking out into the street, the city alive with noise and light around her, Anna felt neither joy nor sorrow. What she felt was finality. The book had closed, the ledger balanced. She had become visible not because he finally looked at her, but because she had built herself into someone who could not be ignored. And as she disappeared into the crowd, she carried with her the certainty that the girl who had once been invisible at a dinner table had become the woman who rewrote the ending of her own story. She thought often about the first time she understood what favoritism truly meant. It wasn't just about gifts or toys or vacations, it was about being seen, about who was worth attention and who wasn't. One spring evening, when she was 11, she had been chosen for a school recital. She practiced for weeks, sitting on the edge of her bed with a borrowed violin, bowing until her fingertips ached. She wanted her stepfather to be there. She imagined him sitting in the audience, clapping as loudly for her as he did when his son scored a goal in soccer. She told him about the recital at dinner, her voice hesitant but hopeful. He barely looked up from his plate. "We'll see," he muttered, the same phrase he used when he had no intention of following through. On the night of the performance, she stepped out onto the stage, scanning the audience with trembling eyes. Her mother was there, smiling brightly, her hands folded under her chin. But the seat next to her was empty. He hadn't come. Afterward, as she clutched her violin case, she saw other fathers hugging their daughters, handing them flowers, telling them how proud they were. Her mother squeezed her hand, whispering that she was incredible, but Anna couldn't shake the hollow ache in her chest. Later that evening, when she returned home, she found her stepfather watching television, a beer balanced on his knee. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't even remember it had happened. That night she lay in bed with the violin case beside her and promised herself that someday he would remember everything he chose to forget. Moments like that repeated through the years, layered on top of one another until they formed a wall of quiet rage inside her. There was the time she made honor roll and taped the certificate to the fridge, only to watch him peel it off without comment to make room for his daughter's art project. There was the day she came home bruised from defending herself against bullies, and he told her she probably provoked it. There was the Christmas when she stayed up helping her mother wrap gifts for everyone else, then woke up to find none with her name on them under the tree. Each incident was a stone in the foundation of who she became. When she left for college, the freedom was almost dizzying. For the first time, she wasn't under his roof, wasn't breathing in the air of someone who thought she was lesser. She worked harder than anyone else, not because she was desperate to prove herself to him anymore, but because she was building armor. Every late-night study session, every extra shift at the diner, every scholarship application filled out in cramped handwriting, it all became proof that she didn't need him. She told herself that she was free, yet some nights when she lay in her narrow dorm bed, she found herself staring at the ceiling, replaying his words in her head. "You're not my responsibility." Those words echoed like a wound that never fully closed. She poured that wound into ambition. By the time she walked across the graduation stage, she was not just surviving, she was excelling. She had offers lined up, mentors eager to guide her, and a resume so polished it gleamed. She looked out at the audience as she gave her valedictorian speech and saw her mother weeping proudly. Beside her was an empty seat where her stepfather should have been. He had made excuses, claimed he was busy with business, but she knew the truth. He hadn't come because she didn't matter to him. And that was the last time she ever let his absence sting. Her rise in the corporate world was relentless. She built a reputation as someone who never overlooked details, who saw what others missed. People admired her for her brilliance, but whispered about her ruthlessness. She didn't mind. They didn't know that her sharpness had been honed in a house where she had been dismissed over and over. She didn't mind the whispers because they never drowned her out. She was heard, she was seen, and that was more intoxicating than anything else. Years later, when he walked into her office, desperate and trembling, the sight almost broke the carefully constructed composure she wore. She had imagined this moment so many times, him on his knees, him begging her to notice him the way she had once begged for his attention. He didn't kneel, but the desperation in his eyes was enough. He asked for her help, not because he loved her, not because he cared for her, but because she was the only one capable of saving him. For the first time, the power was hers. She gave him the illusion of hope, the cruelest and most calculated kindness. She listened to his problems, nodded at his pleas, and told him she would look into everything. He trusted her as if she were the rope thrown to a drowning man. He didn't realize the rope was frayed. He didn't realize she had been waiting her whole life for this. When she began unraveling his empire, it was with precision, not spite. She didn't yell, didn't gloat, didn't reveal her hand. She simply passed information to the right places, nudged the right people, pulled the right threads until everything collapsed. Watching the empire fall was like watching a house of cards she had spent years studying. All it took was one careful breath, and it all came down. The news spread quickly, fraud investigations, frozen accounts, lawsuits piling up. The same man who once puffed his chest at parties, bragging about his wealth and his perfect family, was now the subject of pitying whispers. His friends vanished. His business partners cut ties. His children, spoiled and unprepared, floundered in a world that no longer bent to their demands. Anna watched it all unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned long ago that patience was its own kind of weapon. When she finally saw him again, broken and hollow, she felt no anger. The anger had burned out years ago, leaving behind something colder and sharper. He asked her why, his voice trembling, his hands shaking as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Why hadn't she saved him? Why had she let him fall? "Because you never saved me," she answered simply. And for the first time, he seemed to understand. She walked away, not triumphant but free. The girl who once begged to be seen was gone. In her place was a woman who didn't need his approval, his love, or even his existence. The revenge had not been about destroying him, it had been about liberating herself. And in that liberation, she finally became whole. Anna was only 7 when her mother remarried. She remembered the wedding like a dream, her mother glowing in a white dress, the man beside her tall and confident, smiling as if he had given her the world. Everyone said how lucky they were, how fortunate her mother was to find a man who could provide, who already had a big house and a good name in town. Anna had stood by her mother's side, clutching her hand tightly, secretly hoping that this new man would become the father she had always wished for. At first, he seemed kind enough. He smiled when people were watching, patted her on the head, and introduced her to his own children, a boy a little older than her and a girl her age. They seemed friendly, though a little distant. She thought maybe, just maybe, they could be a family. But the truth revealed itself slowly, in moments that others never noticed. The first time was on her birthday. Her mother baked a cake from scratch, decorating it with messy frosting and crooked candles. Anna was so excited, running into the dining room, expecting something magical. Her stepfather sat at the head of the table, his children on either side of him. They each had brightly wrapped presents stacked in front of them, gifts he had bought them just because. For Anna, there was nothing. He smiled when she opened the cake, clapped half-heartedly, but when the candles went out, he didn't offer a single present. Later, when she asked quietly if he had gotten her anything, he said flatly, "Your mother handled the cake." Isn't that enough? That was the moment something inside Anna shifted. As the years went on, the differences became impossible to ignore. At Christmas, his children tore through piles of expensive gifts, video games, dolls, shiny new bikes. Anna received a sweater, sometimes a small book. When she asked why, he would shrug. "I can't spoil everyone," he would say, though he never seemed to hesitate when it came to spoiling his own. She tried to earn his attention. She brought home report cards filled with A's, carefully laid them on the table, waiting for him to notice. He would glance once, nod, and then turn to brag about his son's mediocre sports performance or his daughter's art project. Once, she asked him if he was proud of her. He looked at her as if the question itself was strange. "Pride is for your real father," he said. "I take care of you. That's enough." The words stung more than she let on. That night, she cried quietly in her room, hugging the report card like it was worthless paper. Her mother came in, wiping her tears, whispering, "He doesn't mean it, Anna. He shows love differently." But Anna knew better. She saw the way he lit up when his own children walked into the room, the way he made time for their games, their events, their birthdays. She saw the difference, and it hurt. As she grew older, the gap widened. His children received new clothes whenever they asked. She wore hand-me-downs until they frayed. His children were enrolled in summer camps, after-school programs, music lessons. When Anna asked about joining a writing program she had been accepted into, he waved her off. "It's too expensive. You won't get anything out of it." Minutes later, his daughter begged to go to a cheerleading camp that cost twice as much, and he agreed without hesitation. At dinner, he asked his children about their days, laughed at their stories, praised their smallest achievements. When Anna tried to join in, his eyes would drift past her, his smile fading into disinterest. She would fall silent, pushing food around her plate, invisible at her own table. One evening, when she was 12, she overheard him speaking to a friend in the living room. "Anna? She's not mine. I do what I can, but she's not my responsibility. My money goes to my blood. That's just how it is." She froze in the hallway, her heart pounding, her stomach twisting with shame and anger. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him she was more than enough, but instead she crept back to her room, biting her lip until it bled. But deep down, a seed was planted. She promised herself that she would never depend on him, never beg for his attention again. If he wouldn't see her worth, she would make herself undeniable. By the time Anna entered high school, his children were used to luxury, coasting through life with no sense of responsibility. His son bragged about skipping class and still getting everything he wanted. His daughter showed off designer bags and planned weekend trips. Anna, meanwhile, worked. She got a job at the local grocery store, stocking shelves late into the evening. She tutored younger kids, earning a few extra dollars to buy her own school supplies. She saved every cent, tucking the money away in a jar under her bed, dreaming of the day she could escape. Her stepfather noticed her independence only once, when she declined to ask him for money to buy a prom dress. She had saved up, bought it secondhand, and altered it herself. When she walked downstairs in the dress, her mother's eyes filled with tears of pride. Her stepfather barely looked up from his phone. "It's nice," he muttered, before adding, "not as nice as what I bought for my daughter." That night, as she danced with her friends, she vowed silently that she would never give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken again. She would rise above him, above his favoritism, above the small world he had tried to trap her in. College became her escape. With scholarships she fought tooth and nail to earn, she left the house that had never felt like home. Her stepfather gave her no support, no congratulations. When she told him she had received a full ride, he smirked and said, "Good. That saves me money." She walked away without replying, holding her head high, knowing one day those words would come back to haunt him. And so Anna built her life piece by piece, far away from the man who had tried to make her invisible. Anna left home with nothing but a suitcase, a few secondhand clothes, and the scholarship letter that had become her lifeline. The bus ride to campus felt like freedom. She watched the scenery blur past the window and thought about how her stepfather hadn't even said goodbye. He hadn't asked what she was studying, hadn't offered to help her move in, hadn't wished her luck. His daughter had cried on her first day of college when he carried her boxes into the dorms, hugged her tightly, and told her he would always be there for her. For Anna, there was only silence, and that silence fueled her. Her first years at university were brutal. She worked nights at a diner, studied until her eyes burned, and woke up before dawn to make it to her early classes. Her classmates wore expensive clothes and talked about vacations in Europe, while Anna counted pennies to afford a cup of coffee. But she didn't complain. Every struggle was proof that she wasn't like his spoiled children. Every sleepless night was a step closer to building something he could never take away. There were moments she almost broke. Once, after a 12-hour shift and an all-night study session, she called her mother just to hear a comforting voice. Her mother whispered that she was proud of her, but Anna could hear him in the background, complaining about money, about how her tuition was such a burden, even though the school paid for nearly everything. He acted like even the air she breathed cost him. Anna hung up quickly, staring at the phone, promising herself again that she would never ask him for a single thing. By the time she graduated, Anna had achieved what no one in her family expected. She was valedictorian, standing on stage in front of thousands, delivering a speech about resilience and perseverance. Her mother sat in the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Her stepfather didn't bother to attend. His children had both dropped out of college by then, wasting the money he poured into them, but he still bragged about them at every dinner party, pretending they were successes. About Anna, he said nothing. After graduation, Anna dove straight into work. She joined a small but ambitious financial firm where she quickly made a name for herself. Her ability to spot inconsistencies in records, her sharp eye for corruption, made her stand out. While others hesitated to point out flaws in powerful people's accounts, Anna did it fearlessly. She didn't care if it made enemies. She had spent her whole life unseen, and now she would be impossible to ignore. Years went by, and Anna rose higher and higher. She bought her own car, her own apartment, furnished with things she paid for herself. She sent her mother money when she could, trying to make life easier for her. Meanwhile, her stepfather's world began to falter. His empire, once so solid, was riddled with cracks. Bad investments. Poor planning. The arrogance that made him successful was now dragging him under. He tried to pretend everything was fine, throwing lavish parties he couldn't afford, buying gifts for his children he had no money to pay for. Anna heard about his troubles through whispers, but she didn't reach out. She waited. The day he came to her office was one she would never forget. She was 28, confident, successful, sitting behind a sleek desk in a building downtown. When her secretary told her she had a visitor, she expected a client. Instead, she saw him, her stepfather, older now, the lines of stress carved deep into his face, his eyes frantic. For a moment, she almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the man who strutted with arrogance. He looked smaller somehow, weaker. "Anna," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I need your help." She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "My help?" "Your family," he said, his tone almost pleading. "And you're smart. Smarter than anyone I know. My business, it's in trouble. I've heard about the work you do, about how you save companies. I know you can fix this. You can fix everything." Anna studied him, her face calm, though inside her heart raced. Family. He was calling her family now after years of making sure she knew she wasn't. She thought of the birthdays with no gifts, the report cards thrown aside, the years of being treated as less. And now here he was, begging. "I'll help," she said finally, her voice steady. "Of course I will." But what he didn't know is that she had no intention of saving him. She went through his books, his accounts, every contract and deal. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. He had built his empire on lies, fraudulent invoices, hidden accounts, money funneled through shell companies. It was worse than she imagined, and he had been sloppy. She collected everything, piece by piece, building a case so airtight it would choke him. She didn't confront him directly. Instead, she began leaking information. Investigators received anonymous packages. The IRS was tipped off. Competitors suddenly had insight into his weaknesses. Every move she made tightened the noose. He came to her weeks later, panic in his eyes. "Things are getting worse," he said, pacing in her office. "Someone is after me. They're digging into my accounts. You need to stop them." Anna kept her expression blank. "I'll do everything I can." But behind the mask, she was smiling. The collapse came quickly. His businesses shut down one after another. His partners abandoned him. Lawsuits piled up. His accounts were frozen, his properties seized. The man who once looked down on her was ruined, his name dragged through the mud. His children, the ones he had given everything to, were left with nothing. They weren't prepared for a life without wealth. They begged for help, cried for answers, but there was nothing left. Anna thrived. She moved her mother into a new home, safe and comfortable, far from the wreckage of his downfall. She kept building her career, rising higher than ever before. The last time she saw him, he was living in a small apartment, stripped of everything. His expensive suits were gone, his face hollow, his pride shattered. He looked at her with desperation in his eyes. "Why?" he whispered. "You could have saved me. You had the power. Why didn't you?" Anna leaned down, her voice calm, steady, and sharp as a blade. "You should have treated me like family," she said. "Instead, I became your reckoning." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the ghosts of everything he had lost, and the memory of the daughter he had ignored until it was too late. She thought about the birthdays the most. The ones that mattered and the ones that had been quietly stolen from her. She could still see the absurd bow on her stepbrother's new bike, remember the way his face lit up as if the world had been made just for him. She could remember how her stepfather had lifted him onto his shoulders that year in the driveway and shouted for the neighbors to come see. For Anna, there was a pattern to those moments, a rhythm of exclusion she could predict like the weather. She learned to brace for it, the laughter in the next room, the rustle of wrapping paper, the way her mother's eyes would plead with her to smile even as they filled with shame. One Christmas, when she was 16, the house smelled like pine and burnt sugar, and the children tore into presents under the tree while records of old carols played softly in the background. Anna had hoped for a book, something to feed the nights she spent writing alone. Instead, she watched as her stepfather handed his daughter a camera, brand new and glossy, with a tone that made it clear the world now expected her to document every extravagant moment he provided. He then turned to Anna and, with a casual cruelty that had become his second language, announced he had already bought new school clothes for his kids and that whatever Anna needed would be discussed later. His voice carried the weight of a sentence, definitive and hollow. She left the living room without unwrapping anything. Alone in the upstairs hallway, she pressed her forehead to the cool plaster and felt tears she would not admit to anyone blur the edges of her vision. Her mother found her there later, fingers trembling as she tried to smooth the hair from Anna's face. "I should have," she began, then stopped. There was no apology big enough, no explanation that could undo the pattern. The words came instead as small comforts. "He doesn't know how to show it. He's complicated." Anna wanted to tell her mother that explanation sounded like an excuse, that attachment and warmth were not complicated when they existed. But she swallowed the anger and nodded, learning again to keep her plans private and her pain carefully catalogued. Those early moments became a ledger in her mind, a list of slights and omissions she filed away like evidence. Each slight taught her a fact: people often rewarded the obvious, and those who needed fighting for usually lost. That realization hardened her. It didn't turn her cruel, it made her precise. She began to plan small acts that required no permission: a scholarship application here, an unpaid internship there, a line on a resume polished until it shone. Where once she had hoped for love, she substituted leverage. Where once she had wanted affection, she chose competence. At university, she discovered an entire world of people who saw her differently. Professors called on her, colleagues read her memos, and clients listened when she spoke. The contrast was dizzying. For the first time, she felt the strange, intoxicating freedom of being taken seriously. It recalibrated something deep inside her. If she could command respect in rooms her stepfather would never enter, then the power to change the script existed. She learned to wield that power with restraint and careful timing. She did not gloat. She built. Work was where Anna's anger found a shape. She learned how corporations hid the truth in language, consulting fees that masked kickbacks, complex ownership structures designed to confuse auditors, shell companies used as drains for illicit cash. She taught herself not only to read balance sheets, but to interrogate them, to see the story's numbers told when they were pushed to the limit. Her colleagues called her ruthless because she would not let a single dubious entry slide. It was a badge she wore without shame. There were nights she almost lost the thread of who she was. After a boardroom confrontation that led to a whistleblower probe she initiated, one of the executives sneered that she was motivated by something personal, that her decisions were less about ethics than vendetta. She had answered calmly, "Call it whatever you like. I call it accountability." But later, in the quiet of her living room, she allowed herself to remember that sneer and to trace again the outline of every omitted birthday, every perfunctory "good job" that had once meant so little. The past was a fuel source. She burned it cleanly. When the rumors about her stepfather's finances began to surface, first as gossip over coffee, then as mentions in industry chatter, Anna felt neither glee nor shock. She felt the old, quiet satisfaction that came from inevitability. People who built empires on shortcuts eventually tripped on them. She had watched the pattern for years: an account opened with little scrutiny, a loan co-signed for the wrong reasons, a partner placated with a check rather than a contract. The weak foundations of his business had always been visible to someone who wanted to look. She had learned not to be that someone for other people's sake. Now, when the cracks showed, she knew how to widen them to collapse. The day he asked her for help, she had been drafting a note to a client, unaware that a polite receptionist would announce his arrival. He looked older, thinner, his voice raw with a kind of panic she had never heard from him. He used her name without warmth, as if rehearsing what a son or favorite would say. "Anna," he said, "I've heard good things. Please help me. I can't. My partners are leaving, creditors are closing in, and I need someone who can make sense of the mess." She listened to him, watched the way his hands fidgeted, the way the arrogance that had always shielded him had slipped like ill-fitting armor. He tore at a thin thread and revealed a vulnerability she had been denied for so long it felt like a fossil of a different life. She felt, somewhere under the professional poise, an old, private triumph. He wanted something she had earned. "Of course," she said. "I'll take a look." He sounded relieved in a way that made bile rise in her throat. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He asked for salvation, for the invisible labor of a woman he had barely acknowledged in public. It was almost laughable, if not for the memory of all the nights she'd sat alone with the sting of exclusion. She could, in theory, have helped him. She could have cleaned the books, patched the leaks, offered the kind of counsel that might have given his very fragile empire another year. But the ledger in her head did not allow for that small mercy. The offenses had been too many, the omissions too purposeful. She began her work with the meticulousness of someone tracing the provenance of a forgery. She read emails he had written with a carelessness that revealed more than numbers. She followed the money into accounts that sprouted like mushrooms in unfamiliar jurisdictions. She found payments labeled as consulting that led to personal credit card bills, corporate funds used to pay for vacations, invoices for services rendered by companies that existed only on paper. The deeper she dug, the more she understood. This was not incompetence. This was design. There were nights she stayed in her office, surrounded by stacks of printouts and spreadsheets, her screen's blue light carving ghosts onto the ceiling. She drank terrible coffee and ate sandwiches that had gone cold. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the small revolutions being planned in dim corner offices. She felt no pity for the man whose treatment had made her into the person riffling through his secrets. Pity had been a currency he hoarded for his own children. She felt only the fierce clarity of a purpose that was no longer merely survival. It was correction. She did not act impulsively. She knew public ruin had a cost. Innocent people could be hurt, and her own name could be dragged through the mud as a vindictive child who had finally had her say. So she cultivated allies carefully. An old professor who had retired to a practice in compliance owed her a favor. A former colleague at a regulatory agency admired her rigor and resented the way power often shielded the arrogant. She reached out to them with constrained, polite emails that said nothing of resentment and everything of due diligence. Connections were a kind of currency she now spent with strategy, not emotion. The months leading up to his downfall became a game of patience and precision for Anna. She didn't rush, because rushing would have given him suspicion or time to prepare. Instead, she played the role of the dutiful stepdaughter he suddenly pretended to cherish. She met him for lunches, sat in meetings as if she were his ally, and even smiled when he complimented her intelligence in front of others. Every time he praised her, she thought back to those dinners when she was a child, when he barely acknowledged she existed. The irony of him depending on her now was almost too sweet to bear, but she kept her composure. She began by gathering everything he had overlooked. His business records were a labyrinth of false invoices, hidden debts, and shell companies meant to disguise the bleeding of money. His sons, the golden boys who had grown up believing the world revolved around them, had been put in positions they weren't qualified for, making disastrous decisions that cost the company millions. His daughter, spoiled and detached, spent money like it was infinite, throwing lavish parties and flaunting her lifestyle online. Anna quietly compiled every piece of evidence. She knew who to send it to, when to send it, and how to make it look like chance rather than a deliberate act. There was a certain satisfaction in watching the cracks appear. First came the whispers in the industry about his company's instability. A few canceled contracts, a few nervous investors pulling out. He brushed it off at first, his pride too large to see the danger looming. "It's just a rough patch," he told Anna one afternoon, sipping scotch in his office as if he had everything under control. She nodded, hiding her knowledge that the rough patch was a tidal wave already on its way. At night, when she was alone in her apartment, she replayed her childhood memories like a slideshow that fueled her resolve. She remembered birthdays where his children received bicycles and electronics, while she got a card signed with just her mother's name. She remembered the sharp sting of his dismissive comments when she asked for help with homework and the way he bragged endlessly about his real kids while she was treated as a guest in her own home. Those wounds never truly faded. They became maps that guided her to this moment. The investigations didn't happen overnight. She ensured the authorities received documents that were impossible to ignore. Anonymous tips about tax fraud, financial mismanagement, and suspicious offshore accounts reached the right ears. Former employees who had once been silenced suddenly found themselves emboldened, speaking out about the corruption they had witnessed. Anna never needed to reveal herself. She let the truth speak louder than her presence ever could. His fall was slow, agonizing, and very public. Headlines splashed his name with words like fraud, collapse, betrayal. Business associates distanced themselves. His sons, clueless without his guidance, tried to salvage what they could but only exposed more of their incompetence. The family's wealth dwindled, their assets seized, their luxury stripped away piece by piece. The mansion they once flaunted was sold under pressure, and the fancy cars were repossessed. Anna didn't watch from the sidelines with glee. She observed with quiet satisfaction, knowing this was the natural order correcting itself. Her mother, caught between loyalty and pain, asked Anna one evening if she knew anything about what was happening. Anna met her eyes, calm and steady, and simply said, "He made his choices." Her mother didn't press further, though in her silence there was something, maybe suspicion, maybe understanding. Deep down, her mother had watched the years of favoritism too. She had seen her daughter pushed aside, though she had been too afraid to challenge it. The most poignant moment came when Anna's stepfather showed up at her office again, only this time he wasn't a proud man seeking help. He was a husk, desperate and pleading. His once-tailored suit hung loose on his thinner frame, his hair grayer, his hands trembling. He sat across from her, his voice cracking as he told her everything he had lost. He spoke of betrayal, of how nobody had stood by him, of how his own friends had vanished. He said the words she had once longed to hear, "You're the only one I can trust." Anna let him speak, her expression calm, her hands folded neatly on the desk. She could see the ghost of the man who once dismissed her, who once told her she wasn't his responsibility. Now he looked at her as if she were the only anchor left in his storm. When he finally begged her to save him, she leaned forward slightly, her voice low but unwavering. "I spent my childhood begging for scraps of your attention. You never came to my recitals, you never celebrated my achievements, you never cared when I cried. And now you ask me for everything you denied me. Do you see the irony?" He blinked at her, his eyes wet, his lips trembling as if he might apologize. But no apology would undo the years of damage. Anna stood, smoothing her jacket, and walked around the desk until she was only inches from him. She looked him in the eyes, seeing not a powerful man but a broken figure crushed under the weight of his own arrogance. She whispered, "You should have treated me like family. Instead, you taught me how to survive without you." Then she stepped away, leaving him sitting there, silent and shattered. She didn't look back, because there was nothing left to look back at. Anna's revenge was not loud or violent. It was quiet, precise, and inevitable. It was years in the making, built from every moment of neglect, every cruel word, every time she was made to feel invisible. In the end, it wasn't just about tearing him down. It was about reclaiming herself, proving that the girl who once sat in the corner with her violin and a broken heart had grown into a woman who no longer needed anyone's approval to shine. And as she walked out of that chapter of her life, leaving behind the ruins of a man who had never seen her worth, Anna felt something she had never known before: peace. The weeks after that meeting blurred into a strange rhythm for Anna. She would wake up in the mornings, drink her coffee by the window of her high-rise apartment, and think about how different life felt now compared to those suffocating years under his roof. Yet, even in her success, there was a part of her that couldn't stop replaying the past. It wasn't regret. It wasn't longing. It was the steady reminder of how far she had come, and how every slight, every neglect, every dismissal had pushed her into becoming the woman she was. Sometimes she thought about the nights she lay awake as a child, listening to laughter from the living room where he and his children sat watching movies together. She remembered pressing her face into the pillow to drown out the sound, tears wetting her cheeks as she wondered what she had done wrong to deserve being excluded. Those memories came back now, not with pain but with clarity. They were the blueprint of her revenge, the silent notes of a melody that had finally reached its crescendo. Meanwhile, his life unraveled with painful inevitability. She heard from contacts in the industry that he was selling off assets at bargain prices just to keep afloat. Former allies whispered that he was toxic, that associating with him could ruin reputations. Lawsuits piled on one another, each new revelation of fraud feeding the fire. His sons, once arrogant and untouchable, started to panic. They called Anna more than once, their voices dripping with desperation. "You're the smart one of them said, his tone more pleading than commanding. "You know how to fix things. You always did. Can't you help us?" Anna listened silently, her heart steady, her voice calm when she finally replied. "When I needed help, none of you cared. You laughed at me. You called me the outsider. Do you remember?" There was silence on the other end of the line. She didn't wait for an answer before hanging up. She didn't owe them closure. Her stepsister, the one who had flaunted her luxuries like trophies, spiraled most visibly. Social media posts turned from glamorous parties to bitter complaints about losing access to her credit cards, about the injustice of having to move out of their mansion into something small and ordinary. Anna would scroll past those posts sometimes, the corner of her mouth curving slightly. It wasn't joy in seeing her suffer, it was the balance of the universe correcting itself. The scales had finally tipped. Her mother, though, was more complicated. One evening, they met for dinner at a quiet restaurant. Her mother looked tired, worn by years of trying to hold together a family built on fractured foundations. She reached across the table, squeezing Anna's hand. "You've become so strong," she whispered. "Stronger than I ever thought possible." There was pride in her eyes, but also sorrow. "But tell me honestly, Anna, did you have a hand in what's happening to him?" Anna held her gaze for a long moment. She could have lied. She could have brushed it off. But instead, she said softly, "I didn't destroy him. I just stopped protecting him. I let the truth find him." Her mother's hand trembled, but she didn't let go. She nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps, deep down, she had always known this day would come. The collapse dragged on for months, each headline a nail in the coffin of his former life. There was no single explosion, no dramatic downfall in one night. It was a steady erosion of power, reputation, and dignity. Anna knew this was worse for him. A quick end might have allowed him to rebuild, but this slow disintegration left him exposed and humiliated. His wealth disappeared, his friends abandoned him, his family turned cold with resentment. The final encounter happened not in her office, but on a street corner one gray afternoon. Anna was leaving a meeting when she saw him sitting on a bench, shoulders hunched, a paper bag of groceries by his side. He looked up at her with hollow eyes, recognition flickering in them like the last embers of a fire. She paused, considering whether to walk past without a word, but something held her still. He gave her a weak smile, the kind of smile that once might have dismissed her existence, but now begged for acknowledgement. "Anna," he said, his voice rough and tired. "I never thought it would end like this." She stood in front of him, her tailored coat shielding her from the wind, her posture straight and unwavering. "You never thought about me," she replied softly. "Not once. And now all you can think about is what you've lost." He shook his head, as if the weight of his own failures was too heavy to carry. "I should have treated you better," he whispered. The words were late, decades too late, and they hung in the cold air between them. Anna looked at him, this broken man who had once towered so arrogantly over her life, and felt no hatred. What she felt was even colder, indifference. She nodded slightly, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step carrying her further from the ghost of her past. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The revenge had already been completed, not in the destruction of his wealth or reputation, but in the quiet strength she carried within herself. He had tried to make her invisible, and yet here she was, shining brighter than he ever imagined. That was the truest victory of all. And as the city lights flickered on around her, Anna realized she no longer needed to think about him or the years he had stolen from her. Her story was no longer tied to his neglect or his downfall. It was her own, finally and completely. Anna carried herself through the city with a kind of quiet resolve that was unshakable. Every corner she turned, every office she entered, every boardroom where her voice commanded attention reminded her of how far she had come. She thought often of the silence she had endured as a child, the feeling of being invisible in her own home, and she contrasted it with the reality of her present life, where no one could overlook her anymore. The irony was sharp. She didn't have to demand respect now, it arrived before she did. But while she thrived, the remnants of her stepfather's once proud world decayed piece by piece. News trickled into her ears, sometimes by colleagues who didn't know of her connection to him, sometimes by whispers at networking events. His company had been raided by investigators. Accounts were frozen, leaving debts unpaid. The sons who strutted around like heirs to an empire were reduced to begging for meetings with lenders who wouldn't return their calls. They were unprepared for reality, spoiled into helplessness, and the more they tried to scramble, the more they revealed their ignorance. Anna allowed herself the smallest smile when she heard that one of them, too lazy to do his own work, had forged documents that only accelerated the collapse. The daughter he adored, the one who once flaunted designer clothes while mocking Anna's second-hand wardrobe, was now shunned by the very social circles she had lived for. The invitations stopped coming. Friends drifted away. Her carefully curated lifestyle dissolved as she tried to keep up appearances, but it was impossible when the credit cards stopped working and the luxury vehicles were repossessed. She turned bitter, lashing out online, blaming everyone but herself. Anna watched from afar, not with joy but with a sense of inevitability. It was the natural consequence of a childhood spent believing she was untouchable. Anna's mother remained caught in the middle, torn between love and regret. She never said much, but Anna could feel her eyes lingering longer, her silences stretching in ways that carried unspoken truths. They shared dinners where her mother would ask small, cautious questions about her work, her happiness, her future. She never spoke directly about what was happening to her husband, but the sorrow in her voice revealed everything. Anna sometimes wondered if her mother, too, felt a shadow of revenge stirring in her, a regret that she hadn't stood stronger for her daughter in those early years. There were moments when Anna considered the path she had taken. She didn't revel in destruction. It wasn't about gloating, and it wasn't about celebrating his ruin. It was about balance, about the scales evening after years of being tilted against her. She thought about the girl she had once been, sitting in her room with a violin, waiting for someone who never showed up. She thought about the nights she wished for acknowledgement, for warmth, for a father's simple pride. Those wishes had died long ago, replaced by determination. And now, watching him fade into irrelevance, she realized that the revenge she had carried all these years wasn't fire, it was ice. Slow, unyielding, and impossible to stop. The last time she saw him was not dramatic. There were no shouts, no curses, no confessions screamed into the night. It was quiet, almost pitiful. He was sitting outside a small grocery store, a paper bag of basic goods at his feet, the weight of failure bending his shoulders. When their eyes met, she saw the flicker of recognition, the weak attempt at a smile. He looked at her as though hoping for a shred of compassion, but she no longer felt compelled to give it. "Anna," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority it once had. "I never thought you'd grow into this." She studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. The years of being overlooked, diminished, forgotten rose in her chest like ghosts, but they no longer hurt her. They only reminded her of what she had overcome. She stepped closer, her voice calm and steady. "You never thought of me at all," she said. His lips parted, as if to apologize, but the words faltered. He lowered his gaze to the ground, shoulders slumping further. She stood in silence, letting him feel the weight of what had passed, the weight of what he had created by refusing to see her as equal. After a long pause, she turned and walked away. There was no satisfaction in the encounter, no triumph. What lingered was peace, a release of the burden she had carried for so long. Her revenge had not been about crushing him, it had been about freeing herself from the need for his approval. She had built a life of strength, power, and recognition without him, and that was the ultimate victory. As she walked down the street, the city buzzing around her, Anna realized she no longer thought of herself as the neglected stepdaughter. That chapter was over. She was simply herself now, whole, unbroken, and finally untethered from his shadow. The weeks turned into months, and the story of his collapse became something of a cautionary tale whispered across the city. Executives used his name as an example of arrogance, of believing that status and bloodlines would shield anyone from consequence. Anna often overheard those conversations at conferences or networking events, and she would sip her coffee quietly, hiding the flicker of recognition in her eyes. Nobody connected her to him anymore. She had built her own name, her own reputation, something untouchable. That, she thought, was the sweetest form of justice. At night, when she allowed herself moments of reflection, the memories always returned unbidden. She remembered the Christmas mornings when she pretended she wasn't disappointed, when she smiled politely at whatever small gift her mother had managed to slip under the tree for her while her stepfather's children tore through piles of expensive presents. She remembered the birthdays where she waited for him to acknowledge her, to say even a simple, "Happy birthday," only to watch him boast about his son's achievements instead. She remembered the sting of overhearing him tell someone that she wasn't really his responsibility, that he already had children of his own. Those words had carved deep lines inside her, and now they echoed like hollow notes. They no longer wounded her, but they explained her resolve better than anything else ever could. His sons began to drift into obscurity, unable to hold on to the positions that had once been handed to them on silver platters. Without his influence, they had no credibility. They sent out resumes that no one took seriously, tried to pitch ventures that fell apart within months, and blamed everyone but themselves for their failures. Anna read about them in small blurbs online, stories of unpaid debts, botched partnerships, even an arrest for one of them when a desperate scheme went wrong. She felt no pity. They had laughed at her once, mocking her clothes, her quietness, her lack of real family. Now they lived in the ruins of their entitlement. The daughter, too, slid further into desperation. The extravagant parties disappeared, replaced by bitter rants on social media about betrayal and unfairness. She posted photos from smaller apartments, trying to pretend she was still thriving, but anyone could see the cracks. Former friends whispered about her behind her back, saying she had become unbearable, clinging to anyone who still had money. She reached out to Anna once, sending a long, rambling message about how they should support each other as sisters. Anna stared at the message for a long time, remembering every sneer, every cutting comment from childhood, and deleted it without responding. Her mother remained the only complicated piece of it all. She was loyal to a fault, still tethered to a man who had caused so much pain. One evening, Anna visited her in the small house her mother had moved into after everything fell apart. The kitchen smelled of simmering soup, the table worn but clean, a single candle flickering in the center. They ate quietly, the comfort of home still lingering despite everything. After dinner, her mother finally spoke, her voice soft. "You've become so strong, Anna. But I can't stop thinking, did it have to happen this way?" Anna set her spoon down and looked at her mother. It was always going to happen. He built his world on lies. All I did was stop protecting him from the truth. Her mother nodded slowly, eyes glistening, as if she carried guilt of her own. Anna reached across the table and held her hand. "You don't have to carry his weight anymore," she said gently. The final image of her stepfather lingered in her mind long after she walked away from him on that street. He had become a man reduced to nothing, stripped of all the pride and power that once defined him. She thought of the way his voice had cracked when he spoke her name, the way his eyes had begged for mercy. But mercy had never been given to her when she was young. He had not lifted her up, he had not defended her, he had not loved her. In the end, all she had done was mirror his lessons back at him. As she moved forward in her life, Anna found herself thinking less and less about him. The revenge, so long carried in her chest like a burning coal, no longer consumed her thoughts. It had burned itself out, leaving behind only ash and clarity. She had proven what she needed to prove, not to him, not to anyone else, but to herself. She had survived, she had risen, and she had built a life where she no longer needed anyone's validation. Walking through the city one evening, she paused to watch the lights flicker on in the tall buildings around her. Behind each window, people lived their lives, chasing dreams, carrying burdens, hiding scars. She realized then that her story had moved beyond him. He had been a chapter, but he was no longer the whole book. She was free to write the rest of her life without his shadow looming over her. And as the night deepened, she felt something she had never truly felt before. Not triumph, not anger, not even satisfaction. She felt peace. Anna often found herself walking through the places of her childhood with new eyes. She would pass by the park where her stepbrothers used to play while she sat alone on the bench, clutching a book to her chest, hoping someone would notice she existed. She remembered the way her stepfather cheered loudly at every goal, every stumble, every little victory they had, while she sat quietly on the sidelines, pretending not to care. In those moments of memory, she could still hear his laughter carried on the wind, always directed toward them, never toward her. Now, when she crossed that park as an adult, she noticed the rust on the swings, the faded paint on the benches, and she thought about how small it all really was compared to the enormity of how it had shaped her. There were nights when the city buzzed outside her window and she couldn't sleep, when she sat at her desk with the glow of her computer and reread files she had long since committed to memory. Every number, every forged document, every questionable transfer told her a story of a man who believed he was untouchable. She traced those stories like a cartographer tracing rivers and mountains, charting a map that would one day lead to his ruin. It wasn't obsession, it was a discipline, a craft she had cultivated over years of being underestimated. Sometimes she imagined what he thought of her as a child, how he must have seen her as a shadow in the corner, someone unworthy of his time or affection. She remembered one particular evening when she was about 13. She had baked a cake for his birthday with her mother, carefully following each instruction, determined to make it perfect. She presented it shyly, a small gesture of love, of wanting to belong. He had smiled briefly, thanked her with a distracted nod, and then turned to praise the expensive gift one of his sons had given him. The cake was pushed to the side, barely touched. That memory stayed with her for years, not because she wanted his approval anymore, but because it reminded her how much she had given to someone who offered her so little in return. The unraveling of his empire was not only financial, it was personal. His friends stopped calling, his colleagues refused to meet his gaze, and even his children, once adored, began to resent him for dragging them down with him. One of his sons lashed out in an interview, blaming their father for ruining everything. Anna watched the footage, the bitterness in his voice, and she thought about the nights when she had been blamed for things she never did, scolded for mistakes that weren't hers, silenced before she had the chance to defend herself. Now the blame had turned back on the man who had shielded his own children from consequence all their lives. Her mother's sorrow lingered like a quiet fog in the background. She still spoke of him with a softness Anna couldn't fully understand, as though part of her remained bound to the man she had once loved despite everything. Anna would sit across from her at dinner, listening to her talk about the past, the early days when things weren't so bitter. She wondered if her mother felt guilt for not protecting her, for letting years of neglect pass without confrontation. Sometimes Anna wanted to ask her, wanted to demand why she hadn't spoken up. But then she would see the lines in her mother's face, the exhaustion in her eyes, and she let the silence linger instead. The day Anna encountered him outside the grocery store, she noticed how the world had shrunk around him. He carried a bag of simple items, nothing of the extravagance that had once defined his life. His shoulders slumped not just with age, but with defeat. He looked at her as though she might offer him salvation, as though the years of ignoring her could be erased with one act of kindness. She remembered waiting for him at school recitals, birthdays, graduations, moments when she had longed for a flicker of pride in his eyes. She had given up on those moments long ago, and now here he was, searching for something she no longer needed to give. She didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't list the years of hurt. She simply told him the truth. He had never thought of her. And that truth was sharper than any accusation could have been. He lowered his eyes, unable to face the weight of what he had done, or perhaps too late to even understand it fully. She walked away, and with each step, she shed another layer of the past. In the days that followed, she realized the revenge had never really been about destroying him. His downfall was inevitable. He had built his empire on lies and favoritism, and it was destined to collapse. Her revenge had been in living, in rising, in becoming untouchable in ways he never thought she could. Every achievement she earned was a rebuke to his neglect. Every success was proof that she had been worthy all along. The girl who once hid her tears in the dark was gone. In her place stood a woman who commanded rooms, who carved out her own space in the world without needing permission. And in the quiet of her own home, with the city lights stretching out before her, Anna realized the most important part of her revenge was not that he had fallen, but that she had risen. Anna remembered the winters most vividly, because that was when the gap between her life and theirs felt widest. She would sit by the frosted window of the living room, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of cocoa her mother had made, and watch as her stepfather bundled his children into thick coats, their laughter echoing as they piled into the car to go ice skating or sledding. She had asked once if she could come along. He had glanced at her, then at the car already full, and said there wasn't enough room. She stayed behind, helping her mother with chores, listening to the front door slam as they left her behind. The house felt colder in those moments, not just because of the winter air, but because of the silence that followed. She would sit at the table, drawing pictures on scrap paper, pretending it didn't matter. But it always did. One birthday in particular haunted her for years. She turned 14, and her mother had made her favorite dish, setting the table with care. She wore a simple new sweater her mother had saved to buy, and she tried to smile, tried to feel excited. But when her stepfather came home, he was carrying a new game console for his son. Everyone gathered around, the focus on the flashing screen as he plugged it in, laughter filling the air. Anna sat quietly at the corner of the table, her plate untouched. When her mother brought out the small cake, he barely looked up, muttered "Happy birthday," without even meeting her eyes, and returned to cheering at the game. She blew out the candles quickly, her cheeks burning, and told herself that one day she would have a celebration where people couldn't ignore her. In school, she poured herself into her studies, not because anyone at home encouraged her, but because she found a kind of escape there. Teachers praised her essays, her projects, her determination. Every gold star, every award pinned to the bulletin board was a small rebellion, proof that she mattered somewhere. She used to carry home certificates, carefully folded in her backpack, and place them on the kitchen counter where he might see them. More often than not, they were swept aside under bills and junk mail. She would find them later, crumpled, coffee-stained, forgotten. Each dismissal hardened her resolve, each rejection fueling something inside her that she didn't yet have words for. As she grew older, the divide became impossible to ignore. Her stepbrothers coasted on charm and the confidence that came from being constantly praised. They boasted about their father's connections, about the easy paths laid out for them. They treated Anna as though she were a guest, a shadow, someone not quite worthy of standing beside them. She learned to stop seeking their approval, but she never stopped watching. Every arrogant word, every careless action, she stored away like pieces of a puzzle she knew she would one day complete. College was her liberation. She left home with a single suitcase and a scholarship that she had earned without anyone's help. Her stepfather didn't contribute a cent, didn't even attend her farewell. Her mother hugged her tightly, eyes wet, whispering apologies for things she never said out loud. Anna stepped onto that campus determined never to feel small again. She worked long hours in the library, picked up shifts in diners, and wrote essays until her hands cramped. Every hardship only sharpened her will. While her step-siblings partied on their father's money, she built a foundation with her own sweat. By the time she graduated at the top of her class, she was no longer the overlooked girl. She was someone people noticed, someone companies sought out, someone respected for her mind. She walked across that stage, the tassels swaying against her gown, and looked into the crowd. Her mother sat there, clapping furiously, tears streaming down her face. Beside her, the seat meant for her stepfather was empty. He had claimed he was busy. She no longer felt the sting. It was exactly what she expected. The years that followed were a steady climb. She became known for her precision, her ability to untangle the messes others left behind. People whispered about her relentlessness, about how she never missed a detail, about how she seemed to see the weak points in every system. She did not tell them where she had learned it. She did not tell them it came from a lifetime of living as the weak point in someone else's family, from learning to survive by noticing what others overlooked. When her stepfather finally came to her, years later, his empire cracking, his pride dimmed, she was ready. She listened to him plead, her face composed, her eyes steady. He told her he trusted her, told her she was the only one who could save him. The irony was almost unbearable. She thought of the nights she had begged him to notice her, the mornings she had tried to win his approval, the years she had stood invisible in his house. Now here he was, begging her. She nodded politely, assured him she would do what she could, and began to weave the threads of his undoing. The collapse was slow, deliberate, like watching a house rot from within until it finally caved. Contracts vanished, partners withdrew, creditors circled like vultures. His children, once so smug, turned frantic, their perfect world crumbling beneath them. They called her, voices dripping with panic, begging for help. She remembered their laughter at her expense, their cruel little jokes, their smug smiles when they excluded her. She told them calmly that she couldn't do anything, that they were on their own. It was the truth, and it was also her justice. Her mother watched it all with quiet sadness. She never condemned Anna, never asked for confessions, but Anna saw the questions in her eyes. She saw the recognition too, the knowledge that perhaps this was the balance the world had been waiting for. When they sat together, sharing meals in silence, Anna felt something she hadn't felt as a child. She felt seen. The final meeting outside the grocery store was the end of it all. He was smaller than she remembered, the arrogance drained, the sharpness of his features dulled by defeat. He looked at her as though she held the key to salvation, but she had long since learned that salvation was something you gave yourself. She told him the truth, that he had never thought of her, and left him with nothing but the weight of those words. When she walked away, she did not feel triumph. She did not feel anger. What she felt was freedom. For the first time in her life, she was no longer tethered to his shadow. The girl who had waited for scraps of attention was gone. What remained was a woman who had built herself into something untouchable. The revenge was complete, not in his ruin, but in her becoming. There was a winter evening when Anna was no more than 10 years old that returned to her often, replaying in her mind like a scene carved into stone. Snow had gathered along the sidewalks, soft and heavy, muffling the sounds of cars outside. Her mother had been in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot of stew. Anna had been in the living room, carefully wrapping a small gift she had saved weeks of allowance to buy, a simple pen set she thought her stepfather might use for his office. She wrapped it in leftover newspaper, smoothing the edges with tape she had borrowed from her mother's sewing drawer. Her heart raced with nervous excitement. She wanted him to notice her, to say something kind, to smile at her the way he smiled at his children. When he came home that evening, his arms were full of shopping bags. His children rushed to greet him, voices overlapping with delight as they tore into the packages, pulling out scarves, gloves, new boots. The house filled with laughter. Anna approached carefully, the small box trembling in her hands. "I got you something," she said softly, offering it up. He glanced at her, a flicker of impatience crossing his face, then took the box absently, tearing it open without care. The pen slid into his palm, and he gave a quick nod. "Thanks," he muttered before turning back to watch his son model the new boots. Anna stood frozen, the warmth that had filled her chest moments before dissolving into a hollow ache. She went to her room, placed her hands flat against her desk, and whispered to herself that one day he would see her, though part of her already knew he never would. As she grew older, the moments piled up like snowdrifts, small slights that became mountains over time. There was the day she came home with a certificate for placing first in her school's science fair. She carried it proudly, the paper crisp in her backpack, eager to show someone who might be proud of her. She laid it on the kitchen counter, waiting for him to return. When he walked in, he barely glanced at it, tossing a set of keys down on top of it before calling for his son to show off a soccer trophy. Anna watched from the doorway, her certificate bent under the weight of his keys. Her mother tried to smile at her, tried to say she was proud, but it wasn't the same. That night, Anna folded the certificate carefully and hid it in a box beneath her bed, alongside all the others. There were birthdays when her step-siblings received bikes and gadgets and expensive clothes, while she was given a single book or nothing at all. She loved books, so she told herself it was enough, But the sting remained when she saw the piles of gifts at their feet. There were family dinners when he praised their achievements, retelling stories of their smallest victories, while she sat silent, her stories unsaid, her accomplishments unnoticed. She learned to disappear at the table, chewing quietly, eyes fixed on her plate, invisible in plain sight. The injustice hardened into something sharp inside her. By the time she was in high school, she no longer sought his attention. She no longer tried to show him her work, no longer reached for praise. She saved her energy for her studies, for the long nights when she hunched over her desk, determined to carve out a future that didn't depend on him. Teachers noticed her drive, awarding her scholarships, offering letters of recommendation. Friends envied her discipline. Nobody knew that it was born not from ambition alone, but from a hunger to prove to herself that she was more than the shadow he forced her to be. Her stepbrothers mocked her seriousness, calling her boring, telling her she tried too hard. Her stepsister laughed at her clothes, hand-me-downs that didn't match the designer outfits she flaunted. Anna endured it quietly, saying little, her silence a shield. What they didn't know was that every insult lodged itself in her memory, every slight preserved like a stone in her pocket. She carried them all, waiting for the day when she could lay them out one by one, proof that she had never forgotten. When she left for college, the divide became complete. Her stepfather barely acknowledged her departure, mumbling something about how she would probably be fine on her own. He didn't offer help, didn't ask about her plans. Her mother hugged her tightly, slipping a small envelope of saved cash into her hand, tears shining in her eyes. "I wish I could do more," she whispered. Anna squeezed her mother's hand and promised she would be fine. As she boarded the bus, she didn't look back at the house. She told herself she was leaving more than just a home. She was leaving behind the years of being unseen. At university, she became someone new. She studied late into the night, took part-time jobs to cover her expenses, and built a reputation as someone relentless and brilliant. Professors noticed her clarity, her ability to cut through problems with precision. She rose quickly, not through privilege but through grit. Each success felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, like rewriting the story she had been handed as a child. She imagined her stepfather's face sometimes, wondered if he ever thought of her, but the thought always left her with a bitter laugh. He didn't think of her then. Why would he think of her now? Years later, when she stood in her office with a view of the city's skyline, her name etched on the door, she felt the weight of the journey behind her. She had built everything herself, without his help, without his recognition. It was in that moment that he came back into her life, broken and desperate. His empire was cracking, his reputation slipping through his fingers. He sat across from her, a shadow of the man he once was, asking for help. She listened, her face calm, her heart steady. For years she had wanted him to look at her, to really see her. Now he did, but only because he had no choice. She let him speak, let him plead, and then she began to weave the quiet, deliberate undoing of everything he had built. As his fortune collapsed, as his children floundered without his protection, Anna watched with the detachment of someone who had already suffered enough. She didn't shout, didn't gloat, didn't tell them it was what they deserved. She simply stood by, letting the world catch up with the man who had always believed himself untouchable. In the end, when she saw him in the grocery store, a small bag of bread and milk in his hands, his shoulders hunched, his eyes hollow, she felt no triumph. She told him the truth, that he had never thought of her, and walked away. That was all the revenge she needed. She returned home that night, sat by her window, and let the silence wash over her. The city glowed beyond the glass, alive and endless. For the first time, she felt unbound. She realized her story was no longer about him. It was about her, about the girl who once waited for attention and the woman who no longer needed it. Her revenge was not in his downfall but in her survival, in her success, in the fact that she had risen despite him.